Hello, I'm Daniela. In today's slow stitching video, we're going to continue with our theme of charming birds, and I'm going to show 6 variations for making the beak. In the first video, I showed creating the charming bird from start to finish, and I showed you my variations, my completed variations. Today, I'm going to show you 6 step-by-step methods for creating the beak. 3 will be made with embroidery floss, and 3 will be made with fabric, but you can interchange them or mix them however you like to create your bird with personality. So let's get started. So to make our beaks, I have 6 birds here with just the body and the wings were done in a previous video, and I'll link that below. But I wanted to show you 6 variations on using that little beak, and this is the beak we made in the original video for the charming birds. So now I want to show you 6 variations using either embroidery floss or little fabrics. I'm going to zoom in so we can look at each bird individually, and then we'll come and look at the entire piece as a whole after we have all our beaks attached. So for our first video, we created a beak that's just an average looking beak. It's very effective and it's very noticeable as a beak. But now if we want to change the personality of the bird, we'll just change the beak. For the first beak we're going to stitch on, we'll use embroidery floss, and we're just going to stitch a short and stubby beak. Now for the second one, we're going to stitch a much longer beak, and it can be thick, it can be narrow, it's totally up to you, but it totally changes the dynamic. And for the third one, we'll stitch just an average size beak or so, more on the long path, might even just make it a little shorter, and we'll create a gradient. And these are the first 3 that we're going to use with embroidery floss. So I'm going to start with my stubby beak here. And what I like to do is, because I like to do a satin stitch, I start from the furthest most point, just like we did on our first video, and I bring that stitch just underneath to where we want it to finish up. And this is my guide, and it also gives just a slight bit of dimension. And then I'm going to start closest to the body, sort of going underneath where we started the body, and I'll create one stitch from one side of that sketch that we made to the other. And then for the next stitch, I'm going to bring it very close and just stitch it down, and that's the satin stitch. And I'll continue this very close, making all my stitches very close together so you're not seeing the fabric underneath. If I happen to make a mistake and you can see the fabric underneath, I'll just go back and add another stitch at the very end. But I'm trying to make them all evenly spaced, and the distance from that little triangle that we created for that short stubby beak. Now this is just a solid color. If you had variegated thread, it would produce something quite interesting. And I just went with a little orange here. You could vary the color as well, make a color pink like the wings, or even green like a color from the body. It's really up to you. Every choice that you make reflects on the personality of the bird. So there we have that short, stubby little beak. I'll knot off the embroidery thread on the back, and then we'll get ready to start our next bird. Now for our next bird, we're going to make this beak longer, and if I had more room on my fabric, I'd probably make it even a little bit longer. So once again, I'm going to start from the furthest most point and make one large stitch going right inside the beak and inside that body. Now, because I want to really emphasize this, I'm going to change my sketch around and make that beak very narrow. I still want a triangle shape, but I want that beak to be narrow. So I have that line sketched, and now I'm just going to make all my stitches from those narrow lines. And because I used a Frixion pen, which is marked as erasable, if I take a hot iron to it, I can remove any of that pen when I'm done stitching. Again, I'm making my satin stitch, so I'll just come across making straight lines. And as you can see here, there's a little bit of space. can go back now or I can go back later. Just add another stitch. I think I'll just add one stitch. And again, I'll just continue this until I create that long, narrow beak. And sometimes you might need more than one stitch to fill in an area. And I'll come right over here. Until I have that beak complete. So there I have my final thread. I can take a quick look and see if there's any places that I maybe skipped a stitch or have the wrong angle. And then I'll just come in and fill that in, just so it doesn't distract from the remainder of the bird. And then I'll knot that embroidery floss on the back. So now, just to make sure that I have my stitch the way I want it, I'll come in there with a hot iron and press it on my fabric to remove any of that marker that remained. And I can see how the beak looks, and I'm quite happy with it. So now we're going to stitch a gradient for the beak. I have the shape already sketched out. I'll use this internal triangle. You can use variegated thread to make that gradient, but I don't have that, so I'm going to use 3 colors of embroidery floss. I have an orange, a yellow orange, and then a yellow. So what I like to do is start with my darkest color closest to the body. So I'm going to take my marker yet again and just extend this beak, just to make sure that it's hidden behind that fabric. And I'm going to come in here and start making my first stitch. And it's going to be quite long, and it's going to be hidden behind that fabric, just like that. And I'll continue making stitches. I like to jump ahead about 1/3 of the way because I know that I have those 2 other colors to add. And so from there, I'll just fill in that area between that first stitch that I put down and that next stitch that I put down 1/3 of the way. And then I can see how that looks if I need more stitches of this color or if I'm ready to move on to the next color thread. So it's mostly covered, so I'll continue adding a few more stitches. And maybe one more. Again, following that original shape that I made of that triangle. Just like that. So it's kind of peeking out. I'm going to come on the back, knot off my thread. And now I'm ready to move to my next color, my medium orange. So starting right where I left off, I'm going to put my needle in and continue to stitch that little triangle that we sketched out. And I know I have 2 triangles, but I'm working on the inner triangle. That's the one that I really want. So I'll add 3 or so stitches of this medium orange color. Then I'll knot the back. And then lastly, I'll stitch whatever stitches remain with this yellow color for that little tip of that beak. It's the same procedure, it's just shorter stitches. So it may only be 3 stitches, it may be 4. Do one more and see if I need another one. And I'm quite happy with the way that looks. I'll knot the back. And once again, I'll take a hot iron and get rid of any of that marker that remains. So that's a very subtle effect, but you can see the difference between the solid color and the little gradient that we created. Now for our next beak, I'm going to use a little piece of fabric cut to an interesting shape. And so I just have a little triangle. I'm going to place it right behind that body fabric, and I have a little triangle. Now because this is a small beak, what I like to do is take my embroidery floss and I pull it apart, and it has 6 strands, and I'm just using 2 of them. And it gives a very thin, light effect. If I had this color sewing thread, like for a machine or hand sewing, I'd use that. But I'm just using those 2 strands of embroidery floss because it's a nice thin effect. I could pin this in place, but I'm just going to hold it with my hand. And I'm just going to tack it down in a few spots with these little stitches. I like to make sure that the little beak is up against the fabric of the bird, right against those stitches, so that it doesn't really move. And I'm just going to make a few little stitches to hold it in place. I don't particularly like working with small pieces of fabric like this. They fray very easily. I tend to lose them, but it's very effective. It gives a very interesting shape, one that you can get with embroidery floss, but it is much faster, and you can get more of a variety of shapes with the fabric. So I really like that. It's just I don't really enjoy working with little fabric like this, but it is quite effective. I only need a few stitches just to lock it in place. I knot off my thread, and then I have just a simple fabric beak. Now it's a similar shape to what we have here or here, but you can see the difference. It's a little more crisp. So for our next 2 birds, we're also going to use fabric. And this is one of the ways that fabric, even though it's small and it can be a little tedious to use, can actually create a very interesting shape. So for the next shaped beak, I want to make a hooked shape. Now I want it to be like a toucan shape, but I want it to be small and fragile because that's what size my bird is. So I have just this little hooked beak, and I can even make it shorter if I want. I'm still using the 2 strands of embroidery floss, and I'm just going to tack it down right here. So again, I start on one side with just a few little stitches, and then I like to go the length of the nose, the little beak here. Again, it doesn't require so many stitches, and I chose a floss color that's similar to the fabric, so it somewhat disappears. There is that texture that you see, so I want my stitches to be facing the correct direction. But again, they don't have to. You can use your stitches as a grid pattern if you'd like, or any type of pattern. So there I have my hooked beak cut out of fabric. So for our final beak, again, I'm going to use fabric. You don't have to. You can use embroidery floss if you'd wish, but I'm going to just create an open beak. So I created kind of a V with my fabric, and now I just want to tuck it into place on my bird. So the bird looks like he's singing or tweeting or chirping. So again, I find the spot where I want, I hold it down into place, and then I just tack a few stitches. Tack a very small stitch down, and then just continue all the way around. Again, I don't need too many stitches, just enough to hold it into position. I'll do the top half of the beak, and then I'll go to the bottom. So there I have my tweeting bird. We'll take a look at all 6 of the variations of the beaks. So here we have our original bird from our first video, and here we have all 6 variations. As you can see, they have a different personality. In the next video, I'll show how I add different tails to the birds. So those are 6 methods for creating different beaks on your charming birds. I hope this inspired you to create your own, or to use some of these with your own flair. Each nuance that you add to your bird will create a different personality and make it really lovable. If you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up and be sure to subscribe. And if you'd like me to check out your work, please post on Instagram and be sure to tag me. I'd love to see what you create. Thanks for joining me today.